Welcome to the Cumbria Chamber of Commerce podcast, your weekly update of business news and issues from around Cumbria. Find out how we support new business and help existing businesses to grow and flourish at cumbriachamber.co.uk. Now here's the Chamber's Business Engagement Manager, Julian Whittle, with this week's episode.
Hello, I'm here with Sir Vince Cable, leader of the Liberal Democrats, a former business secretary under the coalition government, and a self-styled Brexit saboteur. He's in Cumbria to address a chamber event in Kendal. Sir Vince, Brexit is still very much on the mind of businesses. When you were last here in November 2017, you thought there was a 50% chance that the government would get a deal through, 30% chance of a no-deal Brexit, and a 20% chance of Brexit not happening. How do you see it now?
I didn't remember having said that, but I think actually it's not too far wide of the mark. I think the no-deal risk is probably overstated in those figures. I think it's probably less likely. And it's probably a bit more likely that we'll finish up with Theresa May's deal. But even if it's 50-60% for the deal, I think we're down to, 20%, a bit less for no deal. And the rest is the probably, say, 30% more that we could stay after a people's vote. These are all still in play. It's absolutely outrageous, really, that a few weeks before departure day, the country is still agonising over these fundamentals.
I mean, a lot of the businesses that we talk to are very frustrated that they can't plan for Brexit because they don't know what form it's going to take. I mean, you worked in business. If you were running a business today, how would you be preparing?
Well, I think it's worse even than you described, because, of course, if you're doing export sales to the other side of the world, you've already put them on the container,
Yes.
or you've arranged a deal a few months forward. So actually, the no-deal Brexit is already being factored into a lot of business decisions at the moment. I think the direct answer to the question: if you're dealing with the European Union, or your supply chain's affected, then obviously you've got to hold stocks just to ensure you're not caught short. But I think for the vast majority of businesses who are not directly involved in trade, I wouldn't myself be wanting to spend lots of money on precautions for things that very probably won't happen.
Yeah. So how do you see events playing out in Parliament over the next 2 months? Well, I was going to say, do you think Theresa May's bid to renegotiate the backstop will get anywhere? And if it doesn't, how will MPs respond?
Well, sadly, I think we're in this game of chicken where they're trying to bluff the vote with the MPs to get them to get behind the government deal, and try to bluff the European Union into reopening this treaty that had already been completed and negotiated. And this game of chicken, it may suit the world of politics, but it doesn't suit the world of business, because they're going to keep going as long as possible. And we are going to get to March, I think, and this is still not going to be resolved. That's the unfortunate disconnect between the political world and the business world. I think this particular initiative the government's taking, which is quite crudely an attempt to keep the Tory party united, isn't going to work. And so the next thing, what will happen next week and the week after, is the reopening of the split within the Conservative Party, and how that evolves will be crucial.
Do you see then that Article 50, or there'll have to be a request to extend Article 50?
Well, it can happen in one of two ways. It can happen because Parliament is determined to stop no deal and just insists on a postponement. That could happen. Or it could happen because the government does eventually get its way, but then realises that there are all kind of practical things around legislation and so on that they haven't got sorted, and they will then seek an extension. So I think if there is a Brexit day, it's now quite unlikely to be when it was planned. It's much more likely to be in May or June.
I mean, one of the reasons the EU said they would contemplate an extension would be to hold a second referendum or people's vote. Now, you've been vocal in your support for that. Wouldn't it, though, extend all this uncertainty? And why do you think, if there were to be another referendum, that the outcome would be any different from the first one?
Well, I can't predict the outcome. It's genuinely uncertain. I think it's likely to change, to remain, but I'm not absolutely certain of that. It will create a few weeks of uncertainty and unhappiness. That's inevitable, I think. But I think people who say, well, we should just settle for the government's deal as an alternative to a referendum have to think about the fact that the government's deal will not end uncertainty. The basic principles of our negotiating a new agreement with the European Union haven't been started yet. 2 years hence, the transition comes to an end. We face another cliff edge. It could be years after that before all this stuff is sorted out, and we're going to be endlessly arguing and debating and rowing about it. So please, nobody should be under any illusion that not having a referendum just gives peace and quiet and stability. It doesn't.
Now, there has been quite a bit of speculation that Brexit could lead to a realignment of British politics, with Remainer Conservatives and Blairite Labour MPs leaving their respective parties and perhaps coalescing around the Lib Dems to form a new centre party. Indeed, John Woodcock, the MP for Barrow, who is now sitting as an independent, said as much at the weekend. Could that happen, do you think?
Well, I'm pleased that John Woodcock said that. Actually, he wasn't one of the names on my list. But indeed, I think the broad picture he describes is absolutely right. It won't necessarily happen in a very dramatic way or very quickly, but there are large numbers of disaffected Labour MPs and Tory MPs who no longer see very much in common with their parties. I know who they are. We'll talk to them. Some of them we know will leave. Some are thinking about it. And if it happens, and I think there's a high probability it will happen, my view is that they will probably be initially at least independents, and we will work alongside them as some kind of third force in Parliament. But it's like Brexit itself, this is very uncertain.
Well, let's put Brexit aside for a moment. I'm interested in your view of the government's energy strategy. Now, we've been following this very closely in Cumbria. We've seen the demise of plans for nuclear new build, the Moorside project here, and of course also in Wales, Wilfer. Yet, National Grid is forecasting that the total UK generating capacity might have to double by 2050, partly because of the rollout of electric vehicles. So we've got the existing nuclear fleet, if you like, which is coming to the end of its life. We've got this potential increase in demand. How on earth does the UK plug that gap?
Well, we keep being warning of a energy shock, and I'm not totally persuaded of it. I mean, there are things that can be done to make use of our supply more efficiently. I mean, there's a lot of development taking place in battery technology and storage generally, which reduces the need for a big gap between variable and base load supply. And we have these intermittent sources of energy like offshore wind, which are cheap and have proved to be very good and could be smoothed out with a better storage system. But I don't deny that we need increased capacity. I personally have no objection in principle to nuclear power, providing it's cheap and safe. And the problem with the one big nuclear project which is currently going ahead, which is Hinkley, is that it's eye-wateringly expensive relative to gas, and is endlessly delayed by technical problems. So it's not giving nuclear a terribly good reputation. So I would be pragmatic about nuclear power. If anybody can come forward with, good investment projects, I think the Chinese are still interested. I would be pushing ahead with tidal power, which I think the government was very foolish to turn down the option of going ahead with that.
The Swansea Bay scheme.
The Swansea Bay scheme, but there are others up the west coast and elsewhere.
There are two in Cumbria as well.
Well, and we've done a lot of the technology behind it. I think that was a very backward step. And we are going to depend on gas for quite a foreseeable period.
Now, another big issue for the UK, and actually for Cumbria in particular, is productivity. It's crucially important here because Cumbria actually has a shrinking working age population. We've got what's called a super aging population. So businesses are having to find ways of functioning or doing more with fewer people. So how can we boost productivity?
Well, British productivity has been largely static for most of the last decade. I think what's happened is partly a good thing, that we were terrified of mass unemployment after the financial crisis, but instead people started being absorbed and often in relatively low pay and insecure work, but it was at least work. It was better than sitting on the dole. And then that's now got to a point where large numbers of women, people who are retired, are now coming back into the labour force. It's often not great work, but it is something. In terms of productivity, it's a long and complicated story, but the one thing I would focus on is skills, lifelong learning. Britain has an appalling record in vocational training, constantly changing the way it's done. The apprenticeship levy has been a disaster and needs to be scrapped and reworked. So I think the one major answer to productivity is getting young people doing proper vocational skills through their FE colleges and properly structured apprenticeship schemes. And I think from that flows a much more flexible, capable approach to work.
So is the government's technical qualifications, the T levels that they're promoting, is that stepping in the right direction?
That's part of the story. I mean, I think one of the things which I started in government was to try to boost the prestige of apprenticeships and getting apprenticeship qualifications that were recognised through the industries that they applied to. And that is happening slowly, but it really needs to be accelerated.
Now, there's barely a week goes by without another casualty on the high street. There was some good news about HMV being rescued this week, but the direction of travel is clear. Is it inevitable? Because obviously people are buying more online. And how should government respond? And what can we do to reinvent and revitalise town centres?
Well, we can't stop the advance of technology. Some town centres are better than others. A lot of it depends on local councils, pursuing sympathetic policies on parking and amenities and things of this kind. A lot of, traders can help themselves very often with discounting arrangements and loyalty payments. But I think in terms of the big picture, I think there are two things. First of all, the business rate system is very unhelpful. A lot of small companies on the high street are getting relief, but the relief's temporary. I've produced a report recently showing how a system of taxing the land value rather than taxing the property is actually a much better system, particularly for areas like this. And it doesn't tax improvement as the rating system does. And I think the second is we really have to find a proper way of taxing online companies. I mean, I've got nothing against online business. I think, it is the future and we should welcome it and the choice it provides. But the companies doing it don't operate on a level playing field with bricks and mortar companies, and you've got to have a tax system which taxes their turnover or some other way of capturing the value that they are generating.
Finally, Sir Vince, transport. The Lib Dems have supported HS2, but there's dismay in Cumbria. Although the high-speed line isn't coming this far north, the trains will. They'll join the existing network just south of Wigan. But the proposal from HS2 is that they'll operate non-stop between Preston and Glasgow and Edinburgh, so the passengers from Cumbria will have to change trains at Preston. Will you back the Chamber's campaign for HS2 trains to stop here? And isn't there an argument for scrapping HS2 and investing, I think, 56 billion it's supposed to cost on improving the existing rail infrastructure, which is pretty ropey?
I'm sure Tim Farron will make out a very good case for stopping the Lake District, and knowing him, I'm sure he'll succeed in getting that. But in terms of the bigger question, I did sign up to HS2, but I think now we know more about it, I think there are two problems with it. One is that it started in the south and worked north rather than in the north and worked south, which is the wrong way around. And I think even at this stage they could reverse the work. And I think the second thing is that it was supposed to be part of the beginning of a big rail revolution, whereas actually what's happened is that it's crowding out other rail investment. And the real priority now should be something across the Pennines. Hull to Liverpool, it doesn't help Cumbria very much, but better communication systems in the north would seem to me to have priority over the HS2 route.
Okay, thanks very much, Sir Vince. It's always fascinating to hear your take on events.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Cumbria Chamber of Commerce podcast. You can find out more about how we're supporting Cumbrian businesses at cumbriachamber.co.uk and cumbriagrowthhub.co.uk. In the meantime, thank you very much for listening, and we'll have another episode for you next week.